As I explained to you last time, this last paragraph is really a copyright injunction. In the olden days, when they made a haskama, right? In English, they translate haskama as approbation. The only thing you know about approbation is that I have no idea what the word means, which is precisely why the word is used. Haskama means an affirmation, that it's a good sefer. Today, you make a haskama so that you can have a hesped, you want to have a hesped and be able to know what people are going to say about you. After you die, you write a sefer, and then people write haskamas, and then they say all the guzmas. But in the olden days, haskamas were not made primarily to complement the author. Although we have the haskamas from the B'dusha Hanepala and the B'lebakein, which are very full of reverence. But the primary reason for making a haskama in those days was as a copyright, because publishing Sfarim was incredibly expensive. Oh, thank you. Printing Sfarim was incredibly expensive. And the investment was extraordinary, it was exorbitant. And to imitate, to repeat it was much cheaper. So if a person spent all that time laying it out, had to lay it out one letter at a time, by hand, they laid it out on these mattresses, on these matrices, and then someone comes along and just does offset, copies it, it's a terrible loss of money. So there were laws against publishing. And there were criteria. I don't know all the criteria. Here the criteria is 5 years. And the way it was explained to me is that you printed a sefer. For 5 years, nobody could reprint that sefer. If in those 5 years you made a second edition, the 5 years started again. And if in the new 5 years you made a third edition, the 5 years started again. So theoretically, you could hold on to the copyright forever. But if 5 years pass and you don't do another print, then it becomes open to anybody to offset. In the Hayom Yom, you have one of the Hayom Yoms is where it describes the various prints of Tanya and how many exemplarim, how many copies they made. In Tov Kuf Nun Zayin, they made 15,000. Tov Kuf Nun Ches, they made 10,000. Every year or two came out, they had another print of the Tanya. That's how popular it was. That's how many copies had to be published. And as long as you keep on printing it, you hold on to the copyright. This is just in parenthesis. In the year Tafresh Samach, in the year 1900, the Rebbe Rashab reprinted the Tanya. But this time he worked very hard to edit it from all kinds of errors, and he fixed many of the mistakes, typographical errors in the Tanya. He also had it laid out in a very beautiful font, and very beautiful Yossi. And he also added certain things to the Tanya. One of the things that we know he added was the second half of Shara Yichad Monopedic Zayin. But I saw recently there was another edition that cousins were upset about. It's this. This paragraph we're about to read was not printed in the standard editions of the Tanya. In Tafresh Samech in 1900, when the Rebbe printed, the Rebbe Rashab commissioned the Vilna printing house. I'm going to explain this to you just a little bit. Again, he put back in this paragraph, V'hine achash and isfashtu. And the cousins, the other families of the Tzemach Tzedek objected to it. Okay. But what happened was, when the Rebbe Rashab reprinted Tanya at that time, there was no longer a copyright. In other words, the Tanya had not been printed successively within intervals of less than 5 years. So when the Rebbe Rashab commissioned, it was called the Harmon of Achim Ram. It used to be called B'tfus Ram, in the printing house of Ram in Vilna. It was one of the most modern printing houses in the world. And by the way, that printing house still exists. And Barana brought the Rebbe a sefer, and he wrote in the sefer, and he told it to the Rebbe that is the old Ram printing house, the old Vilna Yossi, that they used to print in the time of the Tsar. So the Rebbe, and he was telling the Rebbe proudly that he wrote in the sefer that this is the same printing at the time of the Tsar. The Rebbe said, what's wrong if you write in the time of the communists? So he was like a little bit surprised that the Rebbe would say that the communists caused us so much tzaddis. So the Rebbe said, we got plenty tzaddis from them Tsar. We had plenty of tzaddis before the Bolsheviks. In other words, it's okay if you write that this is, but that printing as upon him still exists. And he printed a sefer in 1991. He brought it to the Rebbe, so long as with the same Yossi, the same font that the Vilna Sfarim were published. So the Vilna owned rights to it. The Vilna printing house printed the Tanya. and they were printed periodically. A few years later, Tafrei Samach Tes, the Rebbe bought the copyright. The Rebbe Rasha bought the copyright. And since that time, the copyright belongs to the Rebbe. Since that time, from 1909 until now. Now there's Tanya's printed probably on average once a week, yeah? It's a little bit less than once in 5 years. So the copyright belongs to us. The Vilna Oisius, the Vilna font, the Vilna print belongs to the Rabbeim. And the Rabbeim Dafke use always the Vilna print. Since that time, there's only one occasion or two occasions where they didn't use the Vilna print. One of them was when they printed the Tanya in Morocco. I don't know the reason, but it had to do with censorship. Had to retype it, had to lay it out again and retype it. So the Tanya Morocco, I think Morocco, has different oisius. It's the same Torah Sadaf, but different oisius. But they always use the Vilna print. Anyway, the point is, when you printed a sefer in those days, copyright had to be guarded. So the Alter Rebbe wrote, when he printed the Tanya the first time, this next paragraph. In other words, I've told you that the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya first. And when he wrote the Tanya, it came out in what was called then Kuntreisim. Kuntreisim means pamphlets. And he never intended to publish it. It just was going to be in Ksav Yad. When he gave out that Tanya in Ksav Yad, this paragraph was missing. Why? There's no copyright on a copy. Anybody can copy. When he rewrote the Tanya for publication, he added this paragraph to honor the copyright of the Tanya, and it was only printed in the first couple of editions, Tov Kuf Nun Zayin and Tov Kuf Samach Zayin, twice. And then it was taken out, meaning to say, after that point, it was sort of understood, if you want to print the Tanya by yourself, go ahead. In Tov Reish Samach, when the Rebbe Rasha put in Moedin Dikakoiches, Rebbe Rasha personally put in Gvaldik Dikakoiches, in printing a Tanya Shleima, which was Shalom in every way, and it was also printed very beautiful. I think I once saw one of those Tanyas. It's now, if you have a Vilna Tanya, it's now 116 years old. It's printed in 1900, now it's 2017, yeah? Happy New Year, Kaminig Ayaduim Fursum, yeah? Today's Happy New Year.
Secular.
Huh?
Secular.
Yeah. So if you've seen those Tanyas, they're Pasha beautiful. Very beautiful paper, very beautiful cover. It doesn't have, the back of our Tanya is a third of the book, yeah? The Hisafas there isn't, but it's a very, very beautiful print of the Tanya. And then this was put back in. So let's read it. V'hine. Achar, shenispashtu hakantreisim anal. Whereas the handwritten, the manuscripted pamphlets that include the Tanya. Now you need to remember, the Tanya then was only two sections. It was Lakutei Amorim Sefer Shal Beinanim, or as the Alter Rebbe used to call it, Beinanim, and Lakutei Amorim Sha'ar HaYichud Ve'emunah. Lakutei Amorim Igeres HaTshuva was not yet included, even though there was a Madura Kame. But when the Alter Rebbe printed the Tanya, he only printed the first two Chalakim. The first time he would print the Igeres HaTshuva would be 9 years. 9 years later, the Rebbe printed the first time the Igeres HaTshuva, and the first time he printed it, he printed the Madura Kama, the first draft of the Igeres HaTshuva, the manuscripted draft. And then the second time he put in already a Madura Bas. In other words, the old Tanya, the written and unpublished Tanya had an Igeres HaTshuva. But when he printed the Tanya, he printed only two Chalakim. 9 years after printing the Tanya the first time, he printed the first draft of the Igeres HaTshuva together with the second draft of the Sefer Shal Beinanim and the Sha'ar HaYichud Ve'emunah. And then subsequent to that, he rewrote the Igeres HaTshuva as well. So you have a Madura Basa, second draft, for all three Chalakim. So originally Tanya was a small book. It was not a very big book at all. I think I saw the Slavita print. It was Rashi Yossi. It was a tiny little book. It was mamish, a handful of pages, but it was very tzafufta. It's very small. And you can have two prakim on a page. It's not so easy to read. And there's no back of the book. There's no bunch of pages in the back about tfusim and disad zachen. Yeah? So the Tanya was not a very big sefer, but he says these pamphlets, which I was handing out to Hasidim, became widely disseminated. Various copies from all different types of scribes who are various and odd, various and mudne, and strange. What that means is when people copy, I think the Rebbe wrote somebody that he has personal experience with editing, that the best copyists make on average 3 mistakes per page. Think about it. The best copyists make on average, the only people in the history of the world who make copies without making any mistakes are the Teimaneh. The Yemenites are, it's mamish alakus. It's godly. The Teimaneh Kisviyad, they're so precise. That's why we rely so much on the Teimaneh when it comes to the writings of the Rambam and so on. They were very precise. Mamish bizn us. They were very, very precise. But Azoi, the best copyist, makes on average 3 mistakes per page. That's why you have to have editing. And on top of that, you had Sefer Meshunim. What's Sefer Meshunim? That the Misnagdim deliberately put into the Tanya forgeries, which were Mishtame, it was written kunstlich, it was written smart. The end from Kfirim. Hine, Ayadei, Yataka is Shenis. Through the various different copies, it became many, and the more many the errors, the copyist errors very, very much. And of course, you know how this works. You buy a pamphlet, and the pamphlet is a copy of an original, and it has a mistake. So you're trying to fix the mistake, and in fixing the mistake, you make even a bigger mistake. And then it's copied a third time, and then there's a mistake on top of that. And it's like broken telephone. You can reach a point where you push, you don't recognize the original sefer. Every person is using his own seichel to decide bodal balank, and you're so far away from the original, it's completely distorted. Ulazeis, and therefore, nodva ruch. There was a benevolence of spirit. Shel enoshim afrasim, of these men who are afrasim. Afrasim means special, honorable, choshev, respectable, hanakuvim, haniskarim, whose names are mentioned me'evil on the other side of the page. Now, I don't know who both of these people were, but one of them was Reb Shalom Shachner Reb Neach. You know what Shalom Shachner Reb Neach is? The Tzemach Tzedek's father. He was one of the 2 people who invested the money. It was very, very expensive. Had the Tanya printed the first time. And it was an investment for profit. They were going to invest and print the Tanya, and they were going to sell the Tanya, and the Hachnosa would be theirs. L'treach begufa mu'me'edim, to exert themselves bodily and financially. Ma'od means geld. Lahavi es kontrei samana lebeis hatzvos, to bring these aforementioned pamphlets to print. Menukim mikol sig v'tor seferim, clean from every impreciseness and typographical error, copyist error. Umugoim hated, and very well edited. In other words, when you print a sefer, then you have to edit it, and you have to edit it, and you have to edit it. And I've heard from people that the best Sfarim are edited as many as 5 or 6 times, and the last editor finds mistakes. You can't give it to the same person to edit more than once. It's impossible. Nor can the person who wrote it edit himself. It's also impossible. You have to give it to someone else. And you can edit, come upon him, and make all the corrections from the earlier edits, and you'll find new mistakes, additional mistakes nevertheless. So I say to this good deed, Yashakech, thank you very much. So in other words, the Alter Rebbe is trying to describe the investment. Whereas it's an explicit pasuk that says, cursed be this one who breaches on the border of his fellow. Now, Hasagas Gavul is technically, I'm learning Perek Echad Bayem and Rambam, so we had this mamish a couple of days ago in Hilchos Geneva. Hasagas Gavul technically means moving a fence. You have 2 neighbors living side by side, and between them you have a fence. You move the fence a few inches. Then you come a year later, move a few more inches. A few more inches. It's Geneva. Hasagas Gavul is only in Eretz Yisrael. It's only by Karka. The lav of Hasagas Gavul, the special lav is Leisasi Gavul Reachar, Asher Govlu Rishoinim goes in Eretz Yisrael. But we use the expression of Hasagas Gavul for any kind of Geneva. It's Geneva. We use the expression, infringing somebody else's domain, it's Hasagas Gavul. In other words, the lav de'erais of Hasagas Gavul has to do with land and Eretz Yisrael, technically. But we apply the logic of any time somebody else has a business and you try to create a competition in a way that makes it impossible for both of you to make a living, like it's in the same street or it's the same material and so on and so forth. We call it Hasagas Gavul. But it's like Geneva. It's not the lav of Hasagas Gavul, it's the inyan of Hasagas Gavul. You're infringing on somebody else's space. So Alter Rebbe says, when somebody infringes somebody else's borders, the pasuk says arur, right? We have Yud Aleph Arurim. It's very interesting. We have 11 curses in Pashas Kisaveh that were said by Hagrizim and Hareva, where the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, and one of them is arur masik bulri. You're not allowed to take the land of a fellow Jew from Eretz Yisrael. And when it says arur, it's a curse, and it's terrible. So, but it's a bad idea to infringe on somebody else's copyright. Al-Kain, therefore, considering the investment, and considering how serious it is to infringe on somebody else's property, I am coming to add to the pasuk. In the Gemara, you have an expression, Yudaved Lekra. In the Gemara, it's a bitmiyah. When the Torah tells you you're not allowed to do something, you don't need the Rav Yehuda to tell you the same thing. Yehuda ve'ed lekra. Rabbi Yehuda is adding to the pasuk, shetim pasuk. So in the Gemara, Yehuda ve'ed lekra is a bit mir. Why do I have to read? Something to the Torah says. Here it's a benichusa that even though it says in the Torah that mentzulei in Yehuda, even though it says in Chumash, order masek v'l'reyehu, it's necessary that I should add to that copyright with my own azhara. In other words, if here Yehuda ve'ed lekra is not a bit mir, it's not a question, it's a benichusa. That chach afilu in the Gemara, Yehuda ve'ed lekra is said as a question. Here, Yehuda ve'ed lekra is a benichus.
What is benichus?
As a statement of fact. Although the Torah says so, I am saying also don't do it. Ka'asina, I'm coming limishdi gudarab, to put up a great guda. Guda means a fence, but the word guda also can connote aniyim for nidif, an aklol. Okay? Al kol hamadfisim, on all publishing houses. Shalei lahatfes katesim, and now not to publish the aforementioned pamphlets. Lo yalei atzmon, not personally. V'lei al yedei yira delehei, nor through certain intermediates and emissaries and through cashiering it by using third parties. Bilti reshus hanekuvim hana, without permission of the aforementioned individuals who made this physical and financial investment. Meshech shacham meishanim meyem kalei satzvus, for a duration of 5 years from the day that the print ends. And ulasheinim yenoim, and to those who listen, they should also be heard. And they should get a blessing of all good and of all good things. And the Alter Rebbe signs Kei Divrei HaMalaket. Kei Divrei HaMalaket. This is the writing of the compiler. Tanya, how many Sfarim in the history of the world are as original as the Sefer Tanya Kadisha? And the Alter Rebbe refers to Likut. Likuti Amorim, HaMalaket. I'll tell you a very gishmak zach. A couple of years ago, a Yid by the name of Rav Nachman Sudek passed away. And he has a grandson. One of the Raskins was Kochzach Stark, and he was Malaki. He listened to his Zayda a lot. His Zayda told many stories, and he wrote a lot of things down. And he's given out certain pamphlets, and he was really kind to me. I was in London last year, so he gave me everything he had on a PDF. And over there, there's a Moed in Dikazach. Where does the name Likut Sichas come from? Likut Sichas comes from Nachman Sudek. Harav Nachman Sudek was a Bachar, and the Rebbe started printing. He gave out the Mugad Sichas in 1958, and he was in 770 a Bachar. And he said to himself, he said to his Chavedim, he says, so Likutei Amorim Tanya, so Likutei Teira, so Likutei Deburim, is the Likutei Sichas. And it didn't happen right away, but the Rebbe accepted the name, but it was in Esarusa Latate. He says, the Tanya is Likutei Amorim, the Likutei Teira is Likutei Teira, the Friedrich Rebbe Sichas, Likutei Deburim, now there's Likutei Sichas. And the Rebbe went along with it. That's what the name, it's very interesting, that's how the name came. Kei Divrei HaMalaket Likuti Amarim. And now this is the words of the compiler of the Likuti Amarim, the collection of sayings that was mentioned before. Now the Alter doesn't even sign his name, which meant theoretically you could read the Tanya and have no idea from the Tanya comes, because the Alter Rebbe really did not put his name in the Tanya. Now, of course, in the first page of the Tanya, there's a whole description of the Alter Rebbe, which the Tzemach Tzedek wrote, I believe. But for many prints of the Tanya, certainly during the Alter Rebbe's lifetime, the Tanya was printed officially. Everybody knew it was, but officially was printed anonymously, unnumbered. Didn't say who the Malaket was. So the Rebbe writes over here a Hakdama, which means an approbation for the purposes of honoring the copyright. So I want to say a few things while I'm talking about this. First of all, the story with the print of the Tanya is a compelling story. I believe I told it to you already. I'm telling it to you again. That the Alter Rebbe gave the Tanya to print in Elul Tokuf Vav, Pashas Kisave. The very end of Tokuf Vav. It's 1797. The Tanya was printed in Kislev, 1797. He gave it for print in Elul, which is September, approximately, or beginning of October, 1797. When the Alter Rebbe gave Tanya to print, so first of all, he gave it on a number of conditions. One of the conditions was that he needed the haskama of his two friends. The Alter Rebbe used to say, this is brought from Chassidim. In other words, I think it's in Yudel Chitrik's Maisis. And the Alter Rebbe said, Ich hab zwei Yedidei Nefesh. I have two friends till the Neshama, till the Etzem and Neshama. Reb Zusha Hanepalo and Reb Leib Kayin. They were the closest friends of the Alter Rebbe, which is interesting because the Baditcher Rav was also a very dear friend. And the Alter Rebbe said he's not going to print the Tanya without the Haskam. So a Shliach was sent to Hanepal. They both lived in Hanepal. They're both buried in Hanepal, surrounding the Baditcher Maggid. The Baditcher Maggid is buried in Hanepal. And he told the Talmidim we'll always be together. He's literally surrounded by a bunch of students. I don't know if it's Mamish 9. Around that cave you can have 9 Kvarim, theoretically. But he's Mamish flanked, his son of Ram. The Malach is surrounded by his Talmidim. So they went to Hanepala to bring the kisvayad of the Tanya to these two tzaddikim, Gedolim, Dr. Rebbe's closest friends, for a haskama. And they both wrote a haskama the same week. Pashas Kisove, Shnas Pedusedish, Tovkuf Nun Vav. And we actually read in the Seder of Chitas, the first day of Chitas, you read their haskamas. You read haskamas with Leba Koinim to Hanepala. And he wouldn't print out that haskama. Then there's a story benegay to that as well. And this was taken in Weinberg's Tanya, the Yiddish Tanya, which the Rebbe was Magia, that the Rishon the Masma David itself, that they brought a copy to each one. And each one didn't know that they brought a copy to the other. Uh-huh. So in the middle of the night, each one ran out of his house to go show his friend the Chiddush. They met on the street by Spilus from the Tanya. They were so, you see how they described the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was alive, remember this. It was during the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe's contemporaries. The way they described the Alter Rebbe, as Baklari Hamida, they had such reverence, they held Alter Rebbe in such high esteem. And the Tanya would not be published with their haskamas, and they both wrote haskamas in the same week. And the Rebbe has whole sichas analyzing why one writes Tavkuf Nun Vav, and one writes Shas Peduseinu, the little details of how they wrote. The Rebbe studies why one wrote like this and one wrote like this and so forth. The Tanya had to have their haskamas. The B'dusha Hanepala said, when he looked at the Tanya and he wrote his haskama, that the Sefer Tanya is the Samei Kteres, Samei Marpe, Samei Akteres, Samei Marpe, for alle Magefis von Ikfis in the Mashiach. B'dusha Hanepala said about the Tanya, this is the potion of medicine, this is the potion of incense, of Kteres, for all the plagues of the Ikfis in the Mashiach. Now, all the tsaras that Yidden are going to have till Mashiach, and this is over 200 years, right? This year is the 220th year. Tafshin, Tafshin Ayin Zayin. So 20 years ago, Tafshin Nun Zayin, we commemorated the 200th year since the first printing of the Tanya. This year, the Tanya is 220 years old since it was printed, and you add another 4 or 5 years since it was written. So Gushan Paul said then that the Lakutei Amorim Tanya is the Samei Marpe, it's the Samei Kteres, which is the refuah for alle magefis for ikfis and mashiach. That was Gushan Hanepal, the spoilers about the Tanya. Where in the case spoilers? And there's another interesting story which also brought Yiduchidik Sefer, that there was a tzaddik nister that also had to give a haskama to the Sefer Tanya Kadisha. And Yiduchidik brings this mice. In other words, we don't have this story from the Rabbi, but Yiduchidik tells the story that there was a Yid from the Mahdam Chassidim who used to travel for business to the Western Europe, to Leipzig. I don't know what Leipzig is. It's Germany, it's Poland, it's Russia. It's Leipzig, I think. It's a Machlekes B'Mtzi is what Leipzig is. It was a good enough reason to start World War II. The Rebbe asks him, how come you don't bring any matanos? He thinks to himself, he brought Alter Rebbe so many gifts, and Alter Rebbe always refused him, and told him, Seine matanos yichya. The Gemara says, the Pasuk, Seine matanos yichya, if you hate gifts, you'll live long. Mitamol, the Rebbe asks him, he solicits, how come you bring any matanos? So he has no idea what to say. Steite. Alter Rebbe continues. At the forest in Leipzig, Geistamon Theater. Alter Rebbe asks him, oh, yeah. When you go to Leipzig, you ever go to the theater? He says, "Geblit mazay stein." A chassid in a theater. Even today, it's today. Then it was about in the church. He said, he doesn't know what to say, but he understood that this was the matan that Alter Rebbe wanted. So when he came to Leipzig, he bought a ticket. Went to the theater. What does a chas do at theater? He went to sleep. The show was over. The lights were on. And the janitor is cleaning up, and the janitor takes the broom and he's poking his legs. Oh. And he wakes up and he sees that everyone's gone. He missed the whole show. And this Yid looks at him, this man, the janitor, the custodian, looks at him and says to him, "You look like a Russian Jew." He says, "Yeah." "Have you ever heard of the city of Lozhny?" He says, "Yeah." "Yeah." So then maybe you heard of Zalman Litvak, he tells him. Alter Rebbe was called Litvak by the Mezritcher Maggid. "Maybe you heard of Zalman Litvak?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Send him regards from Carl." And I think he said, "Et mi gefunden da ich," he found me here also, I'll go and hide in a place he won't be able to find me. Send him regards from Carl. Anyway, when he came back to Russia, he went to Mount Rebbe. He told Alter Rebbe that he went to theater and he met Carl. And he said, "Oh, das is a gute matane, Alter. That's a wonderful, wonderful gift that you wrote from Leipzig." And the following year, when he went to Leipzig again, he went to Alter Rebbe, and Alter Rebbe says, when you go to Leipzig, give this to Karl, but take it back from him. Don't leave it with him. Take it back from him. So he went to the theater, and he slept through a theater, and Karl woke him up, and he says that the Alter Rebbe gave this to him, but that he has to take it back from him. He says, okay, come back tomorrow. The next day he came back, he slept through the show, and this Karl woke him up, he gave him back to Tanya, and I think the expression that he used was, after this Sefer Vosfet Shein Mashiach Magalazai. What will be left for Mashiach to reveal? I think that's the lashon to use. What's Mashiach going to reveal after the Gili of this Sefer? And when he brought it back to the Alter Rebbe, this was a Haskama that the Alter Rebbe wanted, as in the Tzel Chassidim, before he printed the Sefer Tanya Kaddish. But there's a story which is interesting. I don't know. I remember from whom I heard it. I heard it from, he was then a very Hasidic Shabacher. Now he's a very Hasidic Shadid, who was a big Baal Maaseh, not a Magzim. But I don't know his source. So I can't tell you his emes. It's not from the Rabbeim. But the story is that the Alter Rebbe warned him that he should not pass through Berditchev. He didn't want the Berditchev saying the Tanya until Tanya was in print. Because upon him, as friendly and as close as the Alter Rebbe and the Berditchev were, they had a disagreement about Chabad. The Berditchev wrote letters later defending the Alter Rebbe in a moedendik way. But upon him, even though he defended the Alter Rebbe, he didn't 100% agree. I don't know what. They get the mice. Anyway, you understand yourself what happened. Yeah? He spent the night in Berditchev. As soon as he landed in Berditchev, the Berditchev sent a shliach to his hotel and said, "There's a Lubavitcher, Al-Chabad Chassid here. Bring him to me." Now, the Berditchev Rav, he can't play games. With Azam Yid, he can't play games. So he came, and the Berditchev says, "No, you're carrying something." So he started to eke and back into the cups and going to geholfen. And like I said to you before, but the Berditchev Rav, Nishvanka games, he brought him to Tanya. And again, the way the story is told is Alter Rebbe, Baal Shem Tov, the Berditchev Rav, opened the Tanya, page by page. And he ran his hand across the page and said, "Lichtig," which means light. Lichtig. Jeden Daf. Lichtig. Every single page where there's a Ksav Yad, a manuscript. Lichtig. And now, the way the story was told to me was that the result of this is how I heard the story from one of my Alter Bacharim, who was a very Chassidish young man, at Zugenum de Lichtigkeit von Tanya. The Berditchev Rav had, he wasn't maskim, and he took something away from the Tanya, took away a makif, an oil from the Tanya. This is the way I heard the story as a Bacher. I'm repeating to you the story of Yichab Gehed, Dvarim Kavayosan. And like I said, this Bacher certainly didn't make it up. He wasn't shaykh, he isn't shaykh to Guzma, but the story is hard to believe. It's Takesh Veitzig, especially Berditchev Rav. If you see the letter which the Berditchev wrote to the Baruch Mezhebusha, defending the Alter Rebbe, where he writes to him, he says what he's learning, what Reb Zalman is learning, this is what we heard by the Rebbe Mizrich. He said, what I'm teaching, what you're teaching, I don't know. But he's teaching Teda, our Rebbe. And in that letter, he calls the Alter Rebbe, who was younger than him, Adeneinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu. Admur. So the story is hard to believe. This is how I heard the story. Okay, so this is the other Haskamas, which we're not going to learn inside. And the last thing I want to say is that when the Alter Rebbe passed away, his children published a Tanya Shlema. Because during the Alter Rebbe's lifetime, the Tanya had only 2 sections, and then after about 9 or 10 years, they added the 3rd section, which was the Igeres HaTshuva. After the Alter Rebbe was installed, the Mittel Rebbe and his 2 brothers, Chaim Avram and Reb Moshe, decided to publish a complete Tanya. What was their wish? What was their dream? The dream was as follows. The Alter Rebbe wrote very little Chassidus. That's the truth. The Alter Rebbe wrote very little Chassidus. Alter Rebbe wrote much, much more Nigla. Alter Rebbe wrote Shulchan Aruch. Alter Rebbe wrote Shuvas. Alter Rebbe wrote a lot of Nigla. But Alter Rebbe's Chassidus was that he wrote himself is very, very scant. Loshen Admur B'Yatzmei Chassidus that Alter Rebbe wrote with his own pen is very, very little. Their hope was to collect all of the Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe wrote himself. In other words, the Teda Sheva Ksav of the Alter Rebbe, and include it together with the Sefer Tanya Kaddish, because this is the Teda Ksav of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe spoke thousands of Maimorim, Yadua, 2,000 Maimorim, whatever the number is. Alter Rebbe spoke a Gvaldik Maimorim. But it was all Torah Sheba'al Peh. Other people wrote it down. Right? Of all the Lubavitch Rabbeim, the Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe were the only two who didn't write their own Chassidus. They spoke and Chassidim wrote. All the Rabbeim in between, the Middle Rebbe, the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Shabbat, the Rebbe Yatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, wrote their own Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe didn't write. So there's very little of Chassidus in Ksav Yad Kedesh, Ksav Yad Admur. So they were hoping to collect all of it and to publish it in the Tanya Shlema, which came out 1 year after the Alter Rebbe passed away, and they called it Igeres HaKedesh and Kuntres Achar. What's Igeres HaKedesh? Igeres HaKedesh is all the letters and all of the Chassidus, which Alter Rebbe wrote himself. And the Kuntres Acharin is really notes that the Alter Rebbe wrote when he was writing the Tanya. When Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, he brings Inyanim and Kabbalah. And the Alter Rebbe brings Inyanim and Kabbalah in a way that reflects the vision of the Alter Rebbe, Chassidus. And there's full contradictions. Kabbalah is full of stidus. Like just again, the stidus in Shas, stidus in Kabbalah. And when the Alter Rebbe was writing the Tanya, the pieces of Arizal, of Kabbalah, that he brought up, that because of his writing, he was accentuating, he was emphasizing contradictions. The Kisvei Arizal and Kabbalah, the Alter Rebbe used to write notes to resolve those contradictions. And that's called Kuntres Achar Al Kama Pratim, that's what it's called. An afterthought. It's notes that Alter Rebbe wrote while the Alter Rebbe was writing, preparing the Tanya. He wrote for himself these notes. And you should know some of these notes exist in very, very, very short in the Hagos in Tanya. In Tanya Perek Mem there's a Hagos, which is the Nekuda of three of the first Kuntres Achar, the first three Kuntres Achars. He wrote for himself a Pilpul in Kabbalah, which is why it's written in Greek. He can't understand the word because it's the Alter Rebbe talking to himself. It's not a maimer. He wasn't writing it for Chassid. He was writing notes for himself. It's written in a very, very abstract way. And they included the Kuntres Achar Al Kama Prakim also together with the Igeres HaKedesh. So the Tanya now has 5 halakim. Kuti Amarim Sev Shal Benyamin, Kuti Amarim Shalichas Hamuna, Kuti Amarim Igeres HaTshuva, and then you have the Igeres HaKedesh, and you also have the Kuntres Achar. Now the Kuntres Achar, for reasons, first of all, the Igeres HaKedesh has Lamed Beis Simanim, Leiv, 32 Siman. But if you're familiar, there's actually 34. Or maybe even 35. Tezayin, I think Chabez, and Yutes all have a supplement of a Tzveita, which means I think it's Lamed Al and Lamed He. Upon him that the Mitzvah Rebbe wanted that it should come to the Schum of Lev. He wanted to be the number Lev. So 3 of them are without a number. In the end of 16, there's a Maimer which doesn't have a number. In the end of 19, there's an 8 that needs to start on Maimer which doesn't have a number. And the end of 22, also there's another Maimer, another Kuntres, another letter which doesn't have a number. Most of these Igeres HaKedesh were actually letters of Chassidus that were written to Chassidim for tzedakah solicitations. Alter Rebbe tzedakah kocht in Stockholm, Alter Rebbe was into tzedakah. Alter Rebbe believed the solution to every problem is in sinas and tzedakah. So he wrote letters encouraging Chassidim to give tzedakah with an incredible amount of generosity. And when he would make a collection, he would send the shliach with a new letter. And this was the gift to the Chassidim for that collection. In other words, usually it was Keil Chabad. In those days it was called Keil Chassidim. Every year when the Yankov Smilyaner, he was the shliach, would go from shtetl to shtetl and raise money from Alter Rebbe's Chassidim. And Alter Rebbe used to tell each one he had a reshima, or the names of his Chassidim, how much each one should give. And the Yankov Smilyaner would take the money, and as a matana he would leave them a copy of this Igeres HaKedesh. They were malaket and ma'asaf all these Igeres HaKedesh. They put them into the Tanya, together with the Kuntres Achar and Kama Prak. Evidently they didn't get everything. They were still not in Yonim of the Alter Rebbe's Kshavim, which are not in the Tanya. And in Teira Eid, you have Taka in a few places, Loshen Admor Nishmas Eid Ba'atzmi. I don't know if the pshat is that when they printed the Tanya they didn't have him, or that they was not intending on putting everything in. Just in Yonim which has somehow a direction to the Sefer Tanya Kaddish. The last thing I want to say is that in the Kuntres Achar and Taka, the first Kuntres Achar are exactly that. Like the Alter Rebbe's children write in their Hakdama, Pilpulim Amukim, to be Mevader Stidus, never Kisvei Arizal. But the last few are taka letters. Letters about davening ve'amensh, not talking in shul, and so somehow in the Kuntres Achar they didn't only put Kuntres Achar al Kama Prakim, in other words, notes that Rebbe wrote in the preparing the Sefer Tanya Kadisha, but there's also, this is the Tanya Shleima. So when they printed the Tanya Shleima, they also wrote a Haskama, also writing to protect the copyright of the people who reprinted the Tanya Shleima, and from that time on, I think without any exceptions, the Tanya is always printed as 5 halakim. Sheva Shal Benyanim, Sheikh Damuna, Igeres HaTshuva, Igeres HaKedish, and Quintus Achrim. And the Frierdiker Rebbe used to say that this is one of the Ramazim that the Tanya is compared to the Sefer Torah, to the Chumash. The Chumash is Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and the Tanya is Chamisha Chalok. And there's a lot of similarities between the Chumash and the Tanya and the Chumash. And one of them is, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes in his Rishimis, that the Tanya is a Sefer, that the biggest genius who will ever live will never ever understand it completely. And the smallest child can understand it a little bit. Just like Chumash. Chumash is a little bit kleine kinderlach, because kinderlach did herren, they get it, yeah. And the biggest go'onim are trying to decipher the codes, the secrets of the Sefer Torah, the Chumash. Same as your Sefer Tanya Kedisha. It's kakot and kagodol. The smallest person learns it on his level, the biggest person learns it on his level, and nobody ever finishes, gets to the bottom of what's the Sefer Tanya Kedisha. I think I mentioned this to you in one of the early classes, that someone walked in and saw the Alter Rebbe learning Tanya. Alter Rebbe himself was learning Tanya. So he said to the Alter Rebbe, you wrote the Tanya, you authored it, you know it's written here. So the Alter Rebbe said, Ich seh do mehr Nayes wie in Mizrich. I find more news in my own Sefer than I heard from my Rebbe. In other words, the Sefer is written in Ruach HaKodesh. And after the Sefer is written in HaKodesh, the Mechaber is also learning, not his Sefer, but the Rosh Hashanah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Alter Rebbe says, I'm finding in the Sefer which I wrote, and clearly with Ruach HaKodesh, the Eibush that inspired every word and every letter, I'm finding more news in the Tanya Kedisha, which I wrote, than I learned by my Rebbe in Mizrich. If you find the Mer Nais in Mizrich, Vanoch HaLoshen, that the Alter Rebbe said to him, to Chassid, who also asked him, why are you learning the Sefer Tanya Kedisha? So he said, what do you mean? I'm a Beinani. The Sefer Shal Beinani. So he said to the Alter Rebbe, Le'shovek ma'chai l'chol beri. Right, the same thing that you have in the first Perek of Tanya, that Rabbi told his Rebbe, that if you're a Beini, and there's no tzaddikim, and the world can't have a kiyum, how could you be a Beini? The Alter Rebbe gave it. Verschiedene Gersois. One Gersa is Beinani as an Elam Moli. There's a whole world of Beinanim. Another Gersa is a Beinani does 60 Madregas. There's 60 levels of Beinani, and there's upon him by Tzaddikim Gemurim, by Nasi Yisrael, also Maninyan from the Aveda of Beinani. Und noch was sehr Geschmack wird, der Chassidim came to the Alter Rebbe. And they asked Alter Rebbe to say Chassidus. Alter Rebbe said a lot of, in the Yadi years, the last 10, 12 years of his Nasi, Alter Rebbe said Chassidus Anashir. But I'm waiting the Keshef very, very generously. So the Chassidim came to Alter Rebbe, they wanted more, like a fish, as much water as he has, he wants more. And they wanted something specific, I don't know at the moment what it was. And the Alter Rebbe told them like this, I'll say it in Yiddish, I'll translate in English. Gazetten darfst ihr. Alle Tag frische Neues, lehren Tanya. Gleit mir. As von Tanya kämen seine Chossid, as wie Avram Avinu. Alter Rebbe said in Gazetten, you need newspapers, every day you have to have fresh news. Learn Tanya. Believe me that from learning the Tanya you could be a chassid like Avram Avinu. As Alter Rebbe said, you could be a chassid like Avram Avinu. Through all kinds of expressions from the Hakdama lane, but again to the Sefer Tanya Kaddish. And of course we all know the Bavus Davar. Alter Rebbe sat 6 weeks. From the Lashon Alter Rebbe, as for Avav in Benyanim is wert zu sitzen 6 Wochen. Alter Rebbe spent 6 weeks deciding on Avav. Hachib in the Sefer Tanya Kaddish. It says someplace that every time Alter Rebbe wrote a Vav, an extra Vav. In Tanya he would think through the entire Sefer from the beginning until the end. Alter Rebbe put his neshama into the Tanya. He spent 20 years writing it, and so forth and so on. Now, just one more thing I want to say, and then we're going to finish today's shir. The Alter Rebbe gave the Tanya to print in the end of the summer. Tav Kuf Nun Vav. I told this to you before. And he said that he wanted that he should be able to learn from the Tanya on Yortzeit. It says in the Lashon in the what does it say the Lashon inside? Miyayim kalei satfus, not mishnas kalei satfus, not michedish, from the yayim, for the day that the print ends. The Alter Rebbe said to the shluchim who undertook to publish the Tanya that he wants that it should be learned on, to be able to be learned on Yartzeit of his Rebbe. What's the Yartzeit of his Rebbe? Yitzchak Kislev. The Pale, they printed it in Slavita, which was a holy printing house. The Slavita printers were famous. Mamish Heilig mentioned. It was Pashat holy, Heilig. Other printing houses had Goyim. Literally Goyim. You see, in Slavita, it was not only Yidden, it was very Erlich Yidden who laid out the It was a Mamish Kedusha. People say there's a Kedushin Svarim for Slavita. I'm all going to start a glance, a Lichtigkeit, Pashat. Printed Svarim, the Lichtigkeit. There was a Kedusha. They used to title the Matritzen. They were Heilig mentioned. They were, in other words, they were not just making money. They were people who had a sacred duty to, like it says, the pasuk, I say Svarim Harbe. Anyway, Slavita is not Lajna. I don't know exactly what Slavita is, but it's a distance from Lajna. The Alter Rebbe did not know right away the end of the story. They came to him Chanukah, and they told him that they didn't make it. The Tanya was not ready for print, ready for learning. On your test Kislev, it was ready for learning on the Chav Kislev. And the Alter Rebbe said 3 times Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, and I think there's more than one version of this. But first of all, he sighed at the Krechtsketa. And then he said 3 times Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, and then there's different girses. And one of the girses is that he said that Abbas Machshavas Balev Ish, Vatzasavai, he suck a man has all kinds of thoughts. Maybe that's what he wants. When the Alter Rebbe spent 2 years later, 53 days in jail, and it says in Hayom Yom that the Tzrei Yor Terev Aveda, that the 2 years of Terev Aveda, which was added to the world between the time of the printing of the Tanya and the Alter Rebbe's arrest, were one of the best scholars that the Alter Rebbe had for Hatzlacha in his Meiser and his Padiyah and his Geula to be able to redeem it. In other words, the Tanya helped Alter Rebbe. But when he came out of jail in the afternoon of Yitas Kislev, and he became Klayachol disoriented, and he ended up in the house of the Misnagid of Notan, and he sat there for 3 hours. And the Alter Rebbe would say later that the 3 hours in the house of the Misnagid were worse than the whole arrest. So they understood what Alter Rebbe had said 2 years before, 3 times. Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, Chav Kislev, Rabbat Machshav Lavish. I told you the story already, but I think it's something in In Tafshin Mem Aleph, again, I told you all this already when the first shurim I gave you. In Tafshin Mem Aleph, the Rebbe printed Madura Kama of Tanya. The Ksav Yad of Tanya, the Tanya which was never printed. Now the Rebbe wrote the whole Sefer Tanya Kedisha, all 3 halakim. L'kuti Amarim Shara Sefer Rabbeinu, L'kuti Amarim Shara Yichad Amun, L'kuti Amarim Megaris HaTshova. And when he printed it, he rewrote the whole thing with a lot of shinuyim. He added Perek Lamed, Perek Lamed Beis. The old Tanya doesn't have Perek Lamed B'chlal, doesn't have Perek Lev. There's no Abbas Yisrael in the first Tanya. When he rewrote the Tanya, he added the Gvaldik shinuyim. And the manuscript, the Tanya, the Rabbeim had in the Eitzah, the Rabbeim had manuscripts that they kept all these years, including manuscripts of the first draft of the Tanya. In Tafshin Memaf never gave it to print, and a whole committee of Yungalite worked on it. Every single person was the shaykhs to printing. Mistama, your husband was probably didn't come home for weeks. Printed the Tanya. They gave it to the Rebbe 2 days early. The Rebbe asked to have it to Yitas Kislev. They gave it to the Rebbe Yudzayin Kislev, and the Rebbe spoke Shabbos by Fabrengen and said, I am very hard to please. And I never expected this. And he said, this is a tikkun. Imagine a chassidim of our generation. It's a tikkun for what happened by Malta Rebbe. Imagine it. Yidden in our times, what we call culturally younger light. Younger light today had the schus to do something which corrected an inyan that happened by the Alter Rebbe's chassidim when the Alter Rebbe published the Tanya the first time. Miyayim kalei satfus. You understand? Miyayim, the day of the end of the print, whatever that day is. I got some mice.
No, what they printed was
what they printed then was the earlier draft.
In my mouth.
Right. Yeah. But what the Rebbe wanted to be ready to be learned on your side was this Tanya.
What the Alter Rebbe wanted.
Yeah. What the Alter Rebbe wanted.
Where is that Tanya that they did in my mouth?
It's on your shelf in your house. It's a big book. It's a scholarly work. It's not meant for lay people. I mean, we can't explain it, but it's the Rebbe. When the Rebbe pinched the Tanya Yemel, the Rebbe actually gave certain klolim how to learn it. The Rebbe said 3 ha'aras. I was in yeshiva at the time. Maybe it was my base, which meant I was 60 years old. But I remember them with the El Kanis give Chazara. I was in California, so Sunday we hear Chazara. But the Rebbe in that Fabrengen, the Rebbe spoke. He explained the difference between Madura Kam, Madura Basra, and Tanya, and he gave 3 klolim. He made 3 observations. One of them is, for example, in our Tanya, the Seif Perek Gimel, the need is in a bracket, and in that other Tanya, Seif Perek Gimel is not in a bracket. So he explained the difference in Madura Kam, Madura Basra, Tanya, based on these kinds of little details. But the Rebbe Yemel celebrated it. So the Rebbe gave klolim. I think I told this to you. I think I told you everything before. Shalom Spalter from Morristown spent months, maybe he still does it, learning the 2 Tanyas based on the 3 klolim that the Rebbe gave and trying to enlighten the Seder Shebedov.